I stood in the living room, suitcase in hand, staring at my parents who wouldn't meet my eyes. My sister Amanda smirked from the doorway. "I want him gone," she had told them just minutes before. "He's been stealing from us, lying about everything. I can't live in the same house anymore." The words still echoed in my head. 26 years old, and my own family believed her lies over my truth. My mother finally spoke. "Clayton, you need to leave. Tonight." My father nodded grimly. The betrayal cut deeper than any blade ever could. I sat in my car outside the house, hands shaking as I tried to process what had just happened. The engine ticked as it cooled, and streetlights cast long shadows across the driveway where I'd played basketball as a kid with Amanda cheering me on from the sidelines. Now I was being thrown out like trash, my childhood memories contaminated by this moment of ultimate betrayal. 8 months ago, I'd moved back home after losing my job as a construction foreman when Morrison and Associates downsized their operations. The economy had hit construction particularly hard that year, and even experienced guys like me with spotless safety records and strong leadership skills were getting laid off. The company had to cut 30% of their workforce, and despite my supervisor's recommendation to keep me on, corporate decisions came down from executives who'd never set foot on a job site. I'd been helping with the mortgage payments using my unemployment benefits and what remained of my savings from 6 years of steady work. $300 a month went directly to Mom for household expenses. No questions asked, no expectation of getting it back. I understood family responsibility, especially during tough times. More than that, I'd become Dad's primary caregiver since his mild stroke last year. The stroke had affected his left side mobility and short-term memory, making daily tasks challenging and sometimes dangerous. I drove him to physical therapy appointments twice a week, managed his complex medication schedule with 5 different prescriptions at varying times, helped him with his exercises that the therapist insisted were crucial for continued recovery, and stayed alert for signs of another stroke that could be more serious. Mom worked full-time at Meridian Insurance, handling claims processing that required her complete attention for 8 hours a day. She couldn't take time off without risking her job, especially not with Dad's medical bills piling up and my unemployment adding to the family's financial stress. So I'd naturally stepped into the caregiver role, treating it like the important job it was. I'd always been the responsible son, the one teachers and coaches praised for maturity and reliability. While Amanda bounced between part-time jobs at retail stores and restaurants, never lasting more than 6 months anywhere before quitting over some perceived slight or workplace drama, I'd finished trade school with honors, worked my way up from apprentice to journeyman to foreman, saved money religiously, and tried to build something stable and meaningful with my life. Amanda was 24 and had never held a job longer than 6 months. Retail positions at clothing stores ended when she argued with managers about scheduling. Restaurant jobs ended when she showed up late or called in sick too often. Office temp work ended when she couldn't master basic computer skills that she insisted were too complicated for someone with her creative personality. But our parents always made excuses for her. "Amanda's still finding herself," Mom would say. "She's got artistic talents that don't fit traditional work environments." Dad would add, "She just needs the right opportunity to show what she can do." 3 weeks ago, everything changed with a discovery that shattered my faith in family loyalty. I found Amanda stealing money from Dad's medication fund that Mom kept in a manila envelope in the kitchen drawer. It wasn't the first time I'd noticed money missing, but this time I actually caught her red-handed, taking 3 $20 bills from the envelope while Dad napped in his recliner just 10 feet away. The medication fund was sacred in our house. Dad's prescriptions cost nearly $400 a month, even with insurance, and the fund represented his lifeline to continued health and recovery. Mom had started keeping cash there because the pharmacy gave a small discount for cash payments. Every dollar saved mattered with our tight budget. When I confronted Amanda privately in the backyard, she broke down crying with tears that seemed genuine and desperate. "Clayton, please don't tell them. I'm behind on my car payment, and if I lose my car, I'll lose my job at the medical office. I can't ask Mom and Dad for money when they're already stressed about finances. I'll pay it back this week, I promise." She explained that her current job as a receptionist at Westfield Medical was the longest she'd ever kept a position, nearly 4 months, and she was finally starting to feel like she'd found her place. The work wasn't challenging, just answering phones and filing insurance forms. But the office manager had hinted about possible promotion to patient coordinator if Amanda proved reliable. Against my better judgment, influenced by childhood memories of protecting my little sister and hoping this job really would be her turning point, I agreed to give her time to make things right. 2 weeks to return the money and tell our parents about her financial problems. I even offered to help her create a budget and find resources for people struggling with debt management. I know I've made mistakes before, Amanda said, wiping her eyes with tissue from her purse. But this job is different. I like the people, and they seem to like me. I just need to get caught up on bills, and then everything will be fine. I should have told our parents immediately. I should have recognized the pattern that had been repeating since Amanda was in high school. But I wanted to believe she was finally growing up, finally ready to take responsibility for her mistakes and learn from them. But sitting in my car now, watching the house where I'd grown up become just another building I was no longer welcome to enter, I realized Amanda had been planning this accusation for weeks. While I'd been giving her chances to do the right thing, she'd been systematically building a case against me, turning my compassion into the weapon she'd use to destroy my reputation. She'd planted evidence around the house with the methodical precision of someone who'd been thinking about this for a long time. An old class ring from high school that I'd thought was lost forever suddenly appeared in her jewelry box when Mom was helping her organize her room. Amanda claimed I'd stolen it, probably to sell for drug money or gambling debts. A $50 bill that Dad had given me for gas money to drive him to a specialist appointment last month? Amanda told them she'd seen me take it directly from Dad's wallet while he was sleeping. She'd watched me put it in my pocket, she claimed, and confronted me about it privately, but I'd threatened her to keep quiet. The lies were detailed and convincing, because they contained just enough truth to seem plausible. I had received $50 from Dad for gas. I had owned that class ring in high school. But Amanda twisted innocent facts into evidence of criminal behavior, with the skill of someone who'd been practicing deception her entire life. Worse than the planted evidence was her campaign to poison my reputation in the community. She'd been talking to neighbors for weeks, asking seemingly innocent questions that planted seeds of doubt about my character and stability. Mrs. Rodriguez told me later that Amanda had approached her while walking our dog, mentioning casually that she was worried about Clayton since he lost his job. Amanda wondered aloud if Mrs. Rodriguez had noticed Clayton acting differently lately, or seen anything unusual around our house. I thought she was being a caring sister, Mrs. Rodriguez admitted. She seemed genuinely concerned, asking if you'd been drinking more or staying out late or bringing home people she didn't recognize. I told her you seemed fine to me, but she planted doubts in my mind. Amanda had been building a narrative of me as unstable, desperate, and potentially dangerous. She told our cousin Lisa that I'd been muttering to myself and slamming doors when I thought no one was listening. She convinced our Uncle Mark that I was taking advantage of our parents' generosity and freeloading instead of seriously looking for work. The most devastating manipulation was how she'd sabotaged my job search while making it look like I wasn't trying hard enough. Amanda had been intercepting calls from potential employers, telling them I wasn't available, and had found other opportunities. 3 separate companies had tried to reach me about interviews that I never knew about. When Morrison and Associates called about a possible rehire for a project manager position, Amanda told them I'd decided to pursue other career paths and wasn't interested in construction work anymore. The position would have paid more than my previous job and offered advancement opportunities I'd been hoping for. The final blow was the police report. Amanda had actually gone to the police station and filed a formal complaint claiming I'd grabbed her arm during an argument and threatened to make her pay if she told our parents about my supposed stealing. She'd seemed genuinely frightened when talking to Officer Williams, describing an incident that sounded convincing because it followed patterns of domestic abuse that officers were trained to recognize. My parents, already overwhelmed by financial stress and Dad's health concerns, chose to believe their daughter over their son. When Amanda delivered her ultimatum, tearfully explaining that she couldn't feel safe living in the same house with someone who'd threatened her, they made their choice without asking for my side of the story. As I sat there, my phone buzzed with a text from Mom. Your things will be on the front porch tomorrow morning at 10 o'clock. Please pick them up before noon so the neighbors don't see them sitting there. 26 years of being the good son, the responsible one, the family member everyone could count on. And this was how it ended. Not with conversation or investigation or even basic questions about my version of events. Just immediate belief of accusations and immediate ejection from the only home I'd ever known. I started the engine and pulled away from the curb, driving aimlessly through neighborhoods where I delivered newspapers as a kid, where I'd learned to drive in empty parking lots with Dad teaching me patience and safety. Every familiar landmark felt foreign now, contaminated by the knowledge that the people who should have trusted me most had chosen to believe lies instead. I drove aimlessly through town, passing the high school where I'd graduated third in my class, while Amanda barely managed to finish with a 2.1 grade average. Past the community center where I'd volunteered coaching Little League Baseball for 3 summers, teaching kids about teamwork and perseverance. Past the diner where our family used to go for Sunday breakfast before everything started falling apart, back when we could afford simple pleasures and conversations, didn't revolve around money problems and medical appointments. My phone rang around 10:30. Mrs. Rodriguez, our neighbor for 15 years whose own children had grown up playing in our backyard. Clayton, honey, I saw you leave with suitcases. What happened over there tonight? Your parents looked upset, and Amanda was crying on the front porch. I pulled into the empty parking lot of Jefferson Elementary, where Amanda and I had attended school together, where teachers had always commented on how protective I was of my little sister. Under the streetlight next to the playground where we'd spent countless hours, I told Mrs. Rodriguez everything that had happened, my voice breaking, as I described my parents' immediate acceptance of Amanda's accusations. She listened without interrupting, occasionally making sympathetic sounds that reminded me why she'd always been everyone's favorite neighbor. When I finished, she sighed heavily. That girl came to me 2 days ago, Mrs. Rodriguez said, her voice carrying new understanding. She was walking your dog and stopped to chat. Asked if I'd noticed you acting strange lately. Said she was worried about you since you lost your job. She seemed like such a caring sister, but now I understand she was setting you up. Mrs. Rodriguez revealed details that made my blood run cold. Over the past several months, she'd observed Amanda leaving the house at odd hours, with different men in cars she didn't recognize. 2 or 3 in the morning departures that lasted until dawn. Strange vehicles dropping Amanda off with engines running, like people in a hurry to avoid being seen. I thought maybe she was just dating and didn't want your parents to know, Mrs. Rodriguez admitted. But some of those men looked rough, older, not the kind of people you'd expect a girl like Amanda to be spending time with. I suspected drug activity, but didn't want to interfere in family business. The most shocking revelation came next, delivered in Mrs. Rodriguez's careful way of sharing difficult information. Clayton, I saw Amanda with Jake Martinez last week. You know, your friend from the construction company? They were sitting in his truck outside your house, going through papers, and having what looked like a serious planning session. I thought it was odd because you'd never mentioned that Amanda and Jake knew each other. Jake Martinez, my coworker for 3 years, someone I'd trusted with personal information during lunch breaks and after-work conversations. Jake knew about our family's financial struggles because I'd confided in him when Dad had his stroke. He knew about my job search difficulties and my concerns about Amanda's behavior. He knew details about our household that could be used to make lies more convincing. As Mrs. Rodriguez continued talking, the full scope of Amanda's manipulation became clear, revealing a level of calculation that was both impressive and terrifying. She hadn't simply lied about me in a moment of desperation. She'd conducted a months-long campaign to systematically destroy my reputation and credibility. She'd called our cousin Lisa in Portland, tearfully explaining that she was worried about Clayton's mental state after his job loss. Lisa, who barely knew me as an adult but remembered me as a responsible teenager, was easily convinced that unemployment might have triggered psychological problems. Amanda told Lisa that you'd been drinking heavily and talking about getting revenge on people who'd wronged you, Mrs. Rodriguez explained. She said you'd mentioned having plans that you wouldn't discuss, and she was afraid you might hurt yourself or someone else. Similar calls had gone to our Uncle Mark, our father's brother who lived 2 states away but maintained regular contact with the family. Amanda had convinced him that I was freeloading and taking advantage of our parents' kindness while pretending to look for work. She told Mark that you spent your days playing video games and watching television instead of job hunting, Mrs. Rodriguez continued. Said you'd become angry and resentful, blaming everyone else for your problems instead of taking responsibility. Even more disturbing was Amanda's interference with my employment efforts. She'd somehow gained access to our home phone messages and my email account, intercepting communications from potential employers and responding in ways that sabotaged my chances. When Morrison and Associates called about a possible rehire as a project supervisor, Amanda told them I'd decided to pursue opportunities in other industries and wasn't interested in returning to construction. The position paid $23 an hour plus benefits, exactly the kind of stable employment I'd been hoping to find. Richmond Construction had called about an assistant foreman position after receiving my application through their online system. Amanda told them I'd already accepted another position and withdrawn from consideration. 2 other companies received similar responses, all while I continued checking my phone and email daily, wondering why no one seemed interested in my qualifications. I should have said something, Mrs. Rodriguez admitted. But Amanda seemed so genuinely concerned about you, and families go through difficult times. I didn't want to interfere unless I was sure something was really wrong. When I checked my bank account that night, sitting in my car with my phone providing the only light, I discovered Amanda's most brazen theft: $437 missing from my unemployment benefits over the past month. Money that had been automatically deposited and then mysteriously transferred out in small amounts that wouldn't trigger immediate attention. Somehow, Amanda had gained access to my debit card information. She'd been stealing from me while simultaneously building a case about me stealing from the family. The irony would have been funny if it weren't so devastating to my ability to survive independently. I sat on the empty playground where Amanda and I had spent countless childhood hours, remembering when our relationship had been simple and genuine. Before high school, before her first arrest for shoplifting costume jewelry from Walmart, before the underage drinking that became regular drinking that became drinking, and driving that became a pattern of lies and manipulation. I'd covered for Amanda more times than I could count. Made excuses to teachers when she skipped school. Told coaches she was sick when she missed softball practice because she was hungover. Convinced our parents that her failing grades were due to learning differences rather than lack of effort and responsibility. The pattern was crystal clear now. Every time I'd protected Amanda from natural consequences of her choices, I'd enabled her to escalate her destructive behavior. My misguided loyalty, my desire to preserve family harmony, my hope that love and protection would eventually inspire her to change, had created the monster who was now destroying my life with the same calculated precision she'd used to destroy her own. The medication money she'd stolen totaled nearly $800 over 3 months. Money that Dad needed for blood pressure medication that prevented strokes, anti-inflammatory drugs that controlled pain from his physical therapy, and supplements that his doctor had specifically recommended for cognitive recovery. I realized that Amanda's theft wasn't about financial desperation. The medical office job paid $12 an hour for 25 hours a week, enough to cover her minimal expenses if she managed money responsibly. This was about power, control, and the thrill of manipulation. Amanda enjoyed making people dance to her tune while appearing innocent and concerned. She'd perfected the art of playing victim while victimizing others, of seeming vulnerable while calculating her next move, of inspiring protective instincts in the same people she was systematically betraying. As the night grew colder and my car's heater struggled to keep up, I realized I had one option left. Grandpa Joe lived 3 hours north in Millerville, a farming community where he'd spent his entire adult life. I hadn't spoken to him regularly in almost a year, but he was the only family member Amanda rarely mentioned in her conversations. Maybe there was a reason she'd avoided involving Joe in her web of lies and manipulation. Maybe he was the one person who could see through her performance to the calculating person underneath. I started my car and headed north toward the only sanctuary that might remain untouched by Amanda's poison. I woke up behind Murphy's Diner, a 24-hour truck stop on Highway 47, with my neck screaming from sleeping twisted in my car's front seat. The dashboard clock read 6:30 in the morning, and frost covered every surface of my windshield like nature's way of emphasizing how completely cold and alone I'd become. I'd driven north for 3 hours the night before, too emotionally shattered to think clearly about finding proper accommodation, and too financially strapped to afford a motel room after discovering Amanda's systematic theft of my unemployment benefits. Inside the diner, I ordered coffee and wheat toast from a waitress who'd probably seen plenty of people having the worst days of their lives. She didn't ask questions, just provided caffeine and carbohydrates, while I tried to figure out how to rebuild a life from absolutely nothing. I had maybe $200 left in cash after Amanda's financial sabotage, enough for gas and a few meals, but nowhere near sufficient for security deposits or first month's rent anywhere. My unemployment benefits were tied up in a fraud investigation that could take weeks or months to resolve, assuming I could prove that Amanda had stolen my card information. Without a permanent address, I couldn't even apply for jobs effectively. Most employers required local addresses and phone numbers for contact during the hiring process. My cell phone plan was paid through next month, but after that, I'd lose even basic communication ability. At 8 o'clock, my phone buzzed with a text from Mom that felt like a final nail in the coffin. Your things will be on the front porch by 10. Please pick them up before noon so neighbors don't start asking questions. The drive back to collect my belongings felt like attending my own funeral, returning to a place where I'd lived for 26 years that was no longer home and never would be again. The house looked smaller somehow, less significant, just another building in a neighborhood where I was no longer welcome. My possessions sat in cardboard boxes on the front porch, like garbage waiting for pickup. My entire adult life reduced to containers that could fit in my car's trunk and back seat. But as I began loading them, I discovered Amanda's final acts of sabotage, deliberate destruction designed to make rebuilding even more difficult. My laptop computer, absolutely essential for job hunting, online applications, and managing the financial recovery I desperately needed, had coffee spilled across the keyboard and screen. The liquid had seeped behind the display, creating brown stains that made most text unreadable, and the keyboard wouldn't respond to any input. When I tried to turn it on, the screen flickered once before going completely black. 3 years of saved documents, contact information for potential employers, and the digital portfolio I'd been building to showcase my construction management experience were all gone, destroyed as thoroughly as if Amanda had taken a sledgehammer to my professional future. My steel-toed work boots, required safety equipment for any construction job and expensive enough that replacing them would strain my limited resources, had been slashed with a knife. Deep cuts across both uppers made them not just unwearable but dangerous, as damaged safety equipment could cause injuries that would end any chance of employment in my field. Most devastating of all, Amanda had systematically destroyed my professional credentials and documentation. Certificates from trade school, showing completed coursework in construction management, safety training credentials required by most employers, and commendations from previous supervisors had all been torn into confetti-sized pieces and scattered through a box like malicious snow. I spent 20 minutes, kneeling on the front porch, trying to piece together fragments of my electrical safety certification and OSHA training documents, but Amanda had been thorough in her destruction. The pieces were too small and too numerous to reconstruct anything recognizable, let alone officially valid. Looking up at the house, I saw Amanda watching from the living room window, not even attempting to hide her satisfaction with the devastation she'd caused. She smiled and gave a small wave, as if greeting a neighbor instead of celebrating the destruction of her brother's life and livelihood. At the diner that morning, I'd overheard two of my parents' longtime friends discussing the situation over coffee and pancakes. Their conversation made it clear that Amanda's version of events had spread through their entire social circle. "Poor Amanda," one woman said, shaking her head sympathetically. "Having to deal with her brother's problems on top of everything else that family's been through. I heard he's been stealing money and threatening people." "It's such a shame," her companion replied. "Clayton seemed like such a nice boy when he was younger. But sometimes people change when they get desperate. Unemployment can really mess with a man's mind." When I stopped at Mickey's Auto Parts to buy oil for my car, Jake Martinez was there picking up brake pads for his truck. I'd considered Jake a friend, someone whose recommendation could help me find work in the local construction industry. "Clayton," he said, his voice careful and distant, "we need to talk." Jake explained that Amanda had been dating him for several weeks, something I'd known nothing about despite living in the same house. She told him I was actively sabotaging his reputation with other contractors, spreading rumors about his work quality and reliability because I was jealous of his steady employment. She showed me screenshots of text messages where you supposedly badmouthed me to employers, Jake said, his expression mixing anger with disappointment. Called me lazy and unreliable, said I had safety violations that companies should know about. The screenshots Amanda had shown Jake were elaborate fabrications, but convincing enough to destroy his trust in our friendship. She'd created fake conversations that looked authentic, complete with timestamps, and contact information that matched real people in the construction industry. "I believed her because she seemed genuinely scared of you," Jake continued. "She filed a police report, man. Said you threatened her when she tried to confront you about stealing from your family. I can't be associated with someone who's potentially violent." I tried to explain that the police report was fabricated, that Amanda had stolen from me while accusing me of theft, but Jake wouldn't listen. Amanda's manipulation had been too thorough, her performance too convincing. At the police station, I requested information about Amanda's report, hoping to understand exactly what accusations I was facing. Officer Williams, a patient man in his 40s who'd probably dealt with thousands of family disputes, explained that Amanda had filed a detailed complaint describing escalating threatening behavior. According to the report, I'd grabbed Amanda's arm hard enough to leave bruises during an argument about missing money. When she'd tried to confront me about theft from our father's medication fund, I'd supposedly threatened to make her pay if she told our parents about my business dealings. She seemed genuinely frightened when she came in, Officer Williams said, reading from his notes. Crying, shaking, asking about restraining orders and whether we could remove you from the house immediately. The report included details about my supposed erratic behavior, staying out all night without explanation, bringing home people our parents didn't recognize, talking on the phone, in hushed voices, about money and deadlines. No physical evidence, no witnesses to the specific incident, Officer Williams admitted. But the pattern she described fit domestic abuse scenarios we see regularly. We have to take all reports seriously, even when they involve family members. I called my childhood friend Marcus, hoping for one person who'd listen to my side before making judgments. But Amanda had reached him first, planting seeds of doubt about my mental state and reliability. "I don't want any drama, Clay," Marcus said, his voice formal and distant. "Amanda called me last week, really worried about you. She said you'd been talking about getting revenge on people, making lists of who'd wronged you. Marcus, who'd known me since elementary school, who'd been my best man when I'd gotten engaged years ago before that relationship ended for completely unrelated reasons, was now treating me like a potential threat based solely on Amanda's manipulation. Maybe you should get some help," he suggested carefully. "Talk to someone professional about dealing with unemployment stress and family pressure." Amanda mentioned there are programs for people going through tough times. Even my former supervisor at Morrison & Associates, Tom Brennan, wouldn't return my calls about potential rehire opportunities. His secretary told me that the company had moved in different directions and wasn't considering former employees for current openings. I discovered later that Amanda had called Morrison & Associates claiming to be my sister, explaining that I'd been dealing with personal problems and might not be ready to return to work environment that requires reliability and teamwork. Sitting in my damaged car with my destroyed possessions, surrounded by the wreckage of relationships I'd trusted and relied upon, I felt the crushing weight of complete isolation. For a brief moment, I questioned my own memories and perceptions. Had I somehow missed signs of my own instability? Was everyone else seeing something real that I couldn't recognize? But the evidence was too clear, the pattern too obvious. Amanda's manipulation had been systematic, calculated, and devastatingly effective. She'd turned my compassion into weakness, my loyalty into liability, my attempts to help her into weapons she could use against me. I had one remaining option, one person Amanda had barely mentioned, in all her conversations about family dynamics and relationships. Grandpa Joe lived 3 hours north in a farming community that felt like a different world from the suburban complexity where Amanda's lies could flourish. Maybe distance from Amanda's influence had preserved his ability to see truth. Maybe old-fashioned values about family loyalty worked both ways, protecting the innocent as well as supporting the guilty. I started my car and drove north, toward my last hope for sanctuary and understanding, praying that Joe Morrison was still the man I remembered from childhood visits. Fair, wise, and impossible to fool. The drive to Grandpa Joe's farm took me through rolling hills dotted with cattle and old barns, past small towns where main streets still had family-owned businesses and American flags hung from front porches. This was a different America from the suburban confusion I'd left behind, a place where people's words still meant something and family loyalty went deeper than convenience. Joe Morrison's white farmhouse sat at the end of a gravel driveway, lined with oak trees he'd planted 50 years ago, when he'd first bought the property. At 78, he was still sharp and independent, maintaining the house and 20 acres of pasture he leased to local ranchers who grazed their cattle there. He answered the door in work clothes, denim overalls, and a flannel shirt that had seen thousands of days of honest labor. His hands were still strong from decades of farming, his blue eyes clear and intelligent behind wire-rimmed glasses that had been fashionable when he'd first needed them in 1972. "Clayton," he said, studying my face with the careful attention of someone who'd spent a lifetime reading people and situations. "You look like someone stole your dog and then kicked you while you were crying about it. Come on inside." Joe's kitchen hadn't changed since my childhood visits. Yellow walls, white cabinets, a round table where 4 generations of family had shared meals and conversations. The room smelled like coffee and bacon, morning routines that had remained constant, even as the world outside changed beyond recognition. He insisted I eat breakfast while telling him why I'd driven 3 hours to show up unannounced at his door. Joe listened without interrupting, occasionally nodding, or making brief notes on a piece of paper torn from a tablet he kept by the phone. I explained everything chronologically, trying to help him understand the scope of Amanda's manipulation without sounding paranoid or unstable myself. Her theft from Dad's medication fund, her systematic campaign to destroy my reputation, the planted evidence, the false police report, and my parents' immediate belief of her accusations over my denials. When I finished, Joe refilled our coffee cups and sat back in his chair, considering what I'd told him with the patience of someone who'd learned not to make quick judgments about complex situations. "Clayton," he said, finally, "there's something your parents never told you about that house you all live in. Something that changes everything about your situation." I looked at him confused, wondering what property details could possibly matter when I'd been thrown out and forbidden to return. 15 years ago, your father got into some serious financial trouble," Joe began, opening a kitchen drawer and pulling out a manila folder I'd never seen before. "Gambling debts, missed mortgage payments, foreclosure proceedings that your mother didn't even know about until the sheriff showed up with eviction papers." Joe spread documents across the kitchen table, legal papers, bank statements, and correspondence that told a story I'd never heard about my father's hidden struggles. "I bought the house," Joe said simply, pointing to a deed that showed Joseph Morrison as the legal owner. "Paid cash to stop the foreclosure and keep your family from losing everything. But I let your father keep believing he owned it, to preserve his dignity and self-respect." The deed was dated 15 years ago, transferring ownership from First National Bank to Joseph Morrison for the full outstanding mortgage balance plus legal fees. My father's name appeared nowhere on the ownership documents. "Your father's been paying me what he thinks is his mortgage payment, but it's really just rent," Joe explained. "Fair market rent for a house that size in that neighborhood, but rent nonetheless. I figured when I died, the house would go to him anyway, so the arrangement worked for everyone." Joe showed me bank records spanning 15 years, documenting every monthly payment my father had made, along with property taxes, insurance premiums, and major maintenance expenses that Joe had quietly covered without my father's knowledge. "Your father had serious problems with gambling in his 30s, Joe continued. Casino trips to Atlantic City that he hid from your mother, sports betting that spiraled completely out of control, credit card debt for gambling losses that nearly destroyed your family's credit rating. This was family history I'd never known. Problems that had been resolved before I was old enough to understand adult financial struggles." Joe had intervened quietly, buying the house, and arranging for my father to get counseling that had successfully addressed his gambling addiction. He's been clean for 15 years, Joe said, but he never fully dealt with the shame of nearly losing everything. That's part of why he's so protective of family appearances, and why he struggles to confront problems directly. Joe closed the folder and looked at me seriously. Amanda reminds me of your great-aunt Patricia, your grandmother's sister. Same manipulative streak. Same ability to turn family members against each other with lies and emotional manipulation. Patricia had destroyed numerous family relationships over the years, before Joe had finally cut off contact with her entirely. She'd borrowed money she never repaid, spread false rumors about relatives, and created drama that had torn apart holiday gatherings and family traditions. I should have recognized the pattern earlier, Joe admitted. But I hoped your family could handle Amanda's problems without outside intervention. The phone rang, and Joe answered with a brief conversation involving words like investigation, credit fraud, and arrest warrant. When he hung up, his expression was grim. That was Detective Sarah Collins, an old friend of mine from the county sheriff's department, he said. Amanda's in more serious trouble than you know. Joe explained that law enforcement had been building a case against Amanda for weeks, investigating a sophisticated identity theft operation that targeted elderly patients at medical facilities throughout the region. She's been using information from her job at Westfield Medical to steal identities from patients with memory problems, Joe continued. Opening credit cards in their names, making purchases she could easily resell, targeting people who wouldn't notice unauthorized charges quickly enough to prevent significant damage. The investigation had started when family members of elderly patients began reporting suspicious credit card activity that their loved ones couldn't explain. Detective Collins had traced patterns across multiple medical facilities, identifying employees who had access to patient information and opportunity to exploit vulnerable people. The detective estimates Amanda has stolen over $20,000 from at least 12 different families, Joe said. This isn't just theft. It's elder abuse, identity fraud, and organized criminal activity. Jake Martinez had been unknowingly helping Amanda by creating fake websites that looked like legitimate credit card company portals. She'd convinced him they were school projects for a business class she'd never actually enrolled in. Jake thought he was helping his girlfriend with homework, Joe explained. He had no idea the websites were being used to steal personal information from elderly people with dementia. Joe stood up and walked to his window, looking out over fields where he'd worked his entire adult life, where he'd built something honest and lasting through decades of consistent effort. Clayton, I have connections in this county from 40 years as a bank manager before I retired, he said. People still trust my judgment and respect my word. It's time to shake the tree hard and see what rotten apples fall out. He picked up his old rotary phone, the same model he'd used since 1975, with the determination of a man who'd made a difficult but necessary decision. I'm going to call your father now, Joe announced, and you need to hear this conversation. Joe dialed my father's number with steady fingers, while I sat at the kitchen table, my coffee growing cold as anticipation and dread built in equal measure. This moment would either begin my vindication or complete my destruction, depending on whether Joe's word carried enough weight to overcome months of Amanda's manipulation. My father answered on the third ring, his voice cautious. Dad, you never call during the day? Is everything okay? Are you having health problems? I'm fine, son, Joe said, his tone carrying the quiet authority I remembered from childhood, when his word was law and his decisions were final. But I need to tell you something very important about your house, and you need to listen carefully without interrupting. What about the house? Did something happen to it? You don't own it, son. I do. I've owned it for 15 years. The silence stretched across the phone line for nearly 45 seconds, long enough that Joe checked to make sure the connection hadn't been lost. What do you mean you own it? My father finally asked, his voice small and confused. I've been making mortgage payments for 15 years. I have receipts, canceled checks, payment records. You've been paying me rent, Joe explained with the patience of someone delivering difficult news to a person he loved. When you were about to lose the house to foreclosure because of your gambling debts, I bought it with cash to keep your family together. I let you think you still owned it because you needed to preserve your dignity and self-respect. I could hear my father's breathing becoming rapid and shallow, the sound of someone's entire understanding of reality being rewritten in real time. Dad, you can't just tell me this now. What does this have to do with anything? Why are you bringing this up today? Joe's voice became steel wrapped in velvet, firm but not unkind. It has everything to do with what you did to Clayton yesterday. I've been patient with your family's dysfunction for years, but I won't tolerate watching you destroy a good man based on lies and manipulation. You don't understand what Clayton did, my father protested, desperation creeping into his voice. Amanda showed us evidence. Money was missing from Dad's medication fund, and she filed a police report because Clayton threatened her. Amanda is about to be arrested for credit card fraud and elder abuse, Joe interrupted. Detective Sarah Collins will be contacting you within the next few hours about her crimes. Your daughter has stolen over $20,000 from elderly patients, using information from her job. The silence this time lasted nearly 2 full minutes. Joe put the call on speaker so I could hear my father's reaction clearly. That's impossible, my father whispered. Amanda wouldn't do something like that. She's been working hard at that job, finally getting her life together. I'm looking at the investigation file right now, Joe said, tapping the folder on his kitchen table. Clayton tried to protect you by giving Amanda time to confess about stealing your medication money. Instead, she spent those 2 weeks building a criminal case against him while continuing her fraud operation. I heard movement on the other end of the call. Then my mother's voice as she picked up the extension in their bedroom. Joe, please be reasonable, Mom said, her voice strained with exhaustion and stress. Amanda was genuinely scared when she told us about Clayton's behavior. She was crying, shaking, asking us what to do about her own brother threatening her. Amanda is facing multiple felony charges, Joe replied firmly. The police have been watching her for 6 weeks as part of a larger investigation into identity theft targeting elderly people with dementia. Joe explained the credit card scheme in detail, describing how Amanda had used patient information to create false identities, open fraudulent accounts, and make purchases that could be easily converted to cash. The operation was sophisticated enough to suggest planning and coordination with other criminals. Jake Martinez has been cooperating with police since yesterday, Joe continued. He provided evidence of how Amanda manipulated him into creating fake websites that looked like legitimate credit card companies. She convinced him they were school projects, while using them to steal personal information from vulnerable elderly people. My father's voice returned, shaky and small. If this is true, where does that leave us? What happens to our home, our life here? Joe delivered his ultimatum with the calm finality of a judge pronouncing sentence. You have 1 week to pack your belongings and vacate the property. All of you, I won't allow my house to shelter people who would destroy their own family member based on lies. Dad, you can't do this. My father's voice cracked completely. Where will we go? What about Mom's job, my medical appointments? We can't just start over at our age. You should have thought about those consequences before you threw your innocent son into the street without even asking for his side of the story, Joe replied. Sometimes people need to face the results of their choices to understand how serious those choices were. My mother's voice became pleading, desperate in a way I'd never heard before. Joe, please reconsider. We're family. Amanda made mistakes. But destroying our housing situation won't help anyone heal from this situation. Clayton is family too, Joe said simply. And you chose to believe lies about him rather than trusting the character he's shown you his entire life. Family loyalty works both ways, and you forgot that when it mattered most. The phone conversation continued for another 20 minutes, as my parents alternately pleaded, argued, and tried to negotiate alternatives to the eviction Joe had announced. But his decision was final, delivered with the authority of someone who owned the property and the moral high ground. Detective Collins called Joe that afternoon to provide updates on Amanda's case. The charges would include identity theft, elder abuse, filing false police reports, fraud, and conspiracy. The evidence was overwhelming, including Amanda's own admissions during questioning and physical evidence found in her room. Jake Martinez has been very helpful, Detective Collins explained. Once he understood how he'd been manipulated, he provided detailed information about the websites he'd built and the lies Amanda told him about Clayton. Jake had already contacted 3 employers to withdraw negative references he'd given about me, explaining that his information had been based on deliberate misinformation provided by Amanda as part of her manipulation campaign. He feels terrible about his role in this, Detective Collins added. Said he'd be happy to provide positive references for Clayton going forward, and he's recommended him to several contractors who are looking for experienced project managers. Mrs. Rodriguez had spent the afternoon calling neighbors and extended family members, explaining how Amanda had systematically manipulated everyone's perceptions of me through carefully planted lies and fake evidence. Marcus, my childhood friend, called that evening to apologize. "Man, I'm so sorry I didn't listen to you. Amanda was really convincing when she called me, but now I understand she was playing all of us against each other." Marcus explained that Amanda had contacted him 3 separate times over the past month, each conversation designed to plant different seeds of doubt about my mental state and reliability. "She said you'd been talking about making lists of people who'd wronged you, planning some kind of revenge against employers and family members who didn't support you enough," Marcus said. It sounded crazy, but she seemed genuinely worried, like she was scared you might hurt yourself or someone else. The week Joe had given my family to vacate his property had officially begun. Each day brought new revelations about the scope of Amanda's criminal activities and new evidence of my complete innocence in every accusation she'd made. But more than vindication, the week brought something I'd lost: the knowledge that truth and justice could still triumph over lies and manipulation when good people decided to take action despite personal cost. Day 4 of the week Joe had given my family to leave brought the news that would shatter Amanda's world permanently. At 6 o'clock in the morning, police arrived at the house with an arrest warrant, taking Amanda into custody, while my parents watched from their front window in horror and disbelief. Detective Collins called Joe with details about the arrest that revealed just how far Amanda's criminal activities had spread beyond our family's imagination. She'd tried to run when police knocked on the door, climbing out her bedroom window and attempting to scale the backyard fence before being caught and handcuffed in the neighbor's garden. In Amanda's room, investigators found over $15,000 worth of stolen merchandise, jewelry, electronics, designer clothing, and cash that represented months of systematic theft from elderly victims who'd trusted medical professionals with their personal information. During her initial questioning, Amanda finally broke down and admitted to framing me for theft and filing the false police report. But even in confession, she tried to justify her actions with the manipulative reasoning that had defined her entire adult life. "I needed money for bills, and didn't want the family to think badly of me," she told detectives, according to the report Detective Collins shared with Joe. Clayton was going to tell them about the medication money, so I had to make it look like he was the real problem. The scope of Amanda's criminal network was staggering. She'd been working with 3 other employees from different medical facilities across 2 counties, creating a sophisticated identity theft ring that targeted elderly patients with memory problems, who wouldn't notice fraudulent charges quickly enough to prevent significant financial damage. Amanda served as the primary recruiter, using her natural charm and apparent trustworthiness to convince other young medical office workers to participate in what she described as easy money with no real victims. The total fraud exceeded $100,000 when all victims were identified and all accounts were traced. Some families had lost their entire life savings to charges they couldn't understand or dispute. Elderly people with dementia found their credit destroyed, their bank accounts emptied, their financial security eliminated by criminals who'd specifically chosen them for their vulnerability. On day 5, my mother arrived at Joe's farm, accompanied by Amanda's defense attorney, a nervous-looking man in an expensive suit who clearly understood he was representing someone with no viable defense against overwhelming evidence. "Joe, please try to understand," Mom begged, her voice breaking with exhaustion and despair. "Amanda is sick. She needs treatment, not prison time. Destroying our housing situation won't help her recover from whatever drove her to this behavior." Joe listened patiently as the attorney tried various negotiation strategies. If Joe would reconsider the eviction and agree not to testify against Amanda, the family would pay full restitution to her victims and ensure she received comprehensive psychological treatment. "This isn't about money or even punishment," Joe responded firmly. "This is about accountability and consequences." Amanda needs to face the results of her choices, and your family needs to learn that enabling destructive behavior doesn't help anyone. The attorney pressed harder, suggesting that destroying the family's housing stability would actually harm Amanda's chances for rehabilitation. Mr. Morrison, prison is traumatic enough without knowing her family is homeless because of her actions. Guilt over family consequences could actually prevent her psychological recovery. Clayton was homeless because of her actions, Joe replied calmly. Where was your concern about family stability when an innocent man was thrown out with nowhere to go based on lies your client fabricated? The attorney had no answer for that logic, and his negotiation attempts collapsed under the weight of moral clarity that Joe brought to every aspect of the situation. On day 6, my father arrived alone, looking like he'd aged 20 years in less than a week. His clothes were wrinkled, his hands trembled, and his voice carried the defeated tone of someone whose entire understanding of reality had been systematically destroyed. "Dad, I need to talk to Clayton," he said, sitting heavily in Joe's kitchen chair. "I need him to know how sorry I am, how completely I failed as a father to both of my children." Joe allowed the conversation but made it clear that I wasn't obligated to provide forgiveness or absolution on any timeline that made my father feel better about his choices. "I failed as a father to both of you in completely different ways," Dad said, looking directly at me with eyes red from sleepless nights and constant crying. "I protected Amanda from consequences her entire life, thinking love meant rescuing her from her mistakes. And I took you for granted because you never created problems that required my attention." He admitted that Amanda had been stealing from the family for years. Small amounts he'd noticed, but covered up rather than confronting her directly. The pattern went back to high school, when money disappeared from Mom's purse and Dad's wallet, but no one wanted to face the obvious explanation. When she got arrested for shoplifting at 16, I paid the fine and convinced the store manager not to press charges, Dad confessed. When she totaled her car driving drunk at 19, I bought her a replacement and told everyone it was just an accident. Every rescue had made the next problem easier for Amanda to create and harder for the family to ignore. Dad had spent 24 years enabling her destructive behavior, while convincing himself that unconditional support was the same thing as responsible parenting. "You never needed rescuing because you made good decisions and took responsibility for your mistakes," Dad continued. "So I spent all my energy managing Amanda's chaos and took your stability for granted." The community's reaction had been swift and decisive once local media reported on the credit card fraud ring. The newspaper ran a front-page story with Amanda's photograph and details about the scheme that had targeted some of the area's most vulnerable residents. 3 of Amanda's victims were families Joe had helped during his 40 years as a bank manager, people whose trust in him had extended to trusting his judgment about other people. The personal connection made Amanda's crimes feel like a betrayal of Joe's reputation and values. Letters to the editor praised law enforcement for protecting elderly residents and demanded harsh punishment for criminals who exploited vulnerable people. Amanda's name became synonymous with everything the community despised about people who preyed on those unable to protect themselves. Jake Martinez visited the farm that evening to apologize personally and explain how thoroughly Amanda had manipulated his perception of me and our friendship. "She showed me fake screenshots of text messages where you supposedly badmouth me to potential employers," Jake said, shaking his head at his own gullibility. The messages looked completely real, with accurate contact information and conversation threads that seemed authentic. Amanda had invested significant time and effort in creating false evidence that would destroy relationships between me and anyone who might support or believe me. She'd studied social media profiles to understand communication styles and created fake conversations that matched how people actually wrote and spoke. "She seemed genuinely frightened when she talked about you," Jake continued. "Said you'd been making threats, planning some kind of revenge against people who'd wronged you. She was so convincing that I felt like I was protecting her from a dangerous situation." Jake had already contacted 4 different construction companies to provide positive references for me, explaining how he'd been manipulated into giving false negative information. Several employers who'd previously rejected my applications based on his recommendations were now interested in interviewing me for available positions. Day 7 arrived gray and rainy, fitting weather for watching my parents pack their belongings and load them into a rented truck. Through Joe's kitchen window, I observed them moving like people in shock, handling their possessions carefully, as they prepared to leave the house where they'd lived for 2 decades. They'd found a small 2-bedroom apartment within walking distance of Mom's workplace, a significant downgrade from the 4-bedroom house they'd believed they owned. Dad's medical care would be more complicated without reliable transportation, but Joe had arranged referrals to doctors in the county who accepted his insurance. Mom left a handwritten letter with Joe, asking him to give it to me when he thought I was ready to read it. "I hope someday Clayton can forgive us," the letter said. We were wrong to believe lies about our son's character, instead of trusting what we'd observed about him for 26 years. Dad returned Joe's house keys along with copies of documents he'd thought proved his ownership of the property. For the first time, he fully accepted that his choices had consequences, and that his father's generosity had limits. Amanda's legal proceedings moved quickly once she decided to accept a plea bargain rather than risk trial with overwhelming evidence against her. 5 years in prison with possibility of parole after 2.5 years. Mandatory restitution to all victims. Court-ordered psychological evaluation and comprehensive treatment for whatever underlying issues had driven her criminal behavior. The judge also imposed a no-contact order between Amanda and me for 2 full years, providing both of us with time to heal and grow, without the possibility of further manipulation attempts. "Miss Morrison," the judge said during sentencing, "your crimes targeted some of our community's most vulnerable residents. You violated their trust, destroyed their financial security, and caused trauma that extends far beyond monetary losses. Prison time is necessary, not just for punishment, but to protect other potential victims from your documented willingness to exploit vulnerable people." As the week ended, I realized that justice in this situation wasn't primarily about punishment or revenge. It was about truth, accountability, and the restoration of relationships based on honesty rather than manipulation and enabling. Amanda would face consequences that might finally force her to confront the destructive patterns she'd developed over decades. My parents would learn to function as adults without constantly managing crisis situations of Amanda's creation. And I would rebuild my life with clear boundaries and better understanding of the difference between loyalty and enabling. 3 months later, I stood on the front porch of Joe's farmhouse, watching the sunrise paint the sky, orange and pink, above rolling fields that had become my new horizon. Everything about my life had changed, but for the first time since childhood, change felt like progress rather than loss. Joe and I had developed a partnership that transformed both our lives in unexpected ways. I'd moved in permanently as more than just his temporary guest. Together, we managed not only his farm, but his portfolio of rental properties throughout the county, investments he'd accumulated over decades of careful saving and wise decision-making. My construction experience proved invaluable for maintaining and improving his properties. Skills I'd developed in residential and commercial construction translated perfectly to the ongoing work of keeping rental houses competitive and profitable. Joe provided guidance, connections, and financial backing, while I handled physical improvements and day-to-day management. Through Joe's reputation and my restored credibility, I'd found excellent employment as a project manager with Hartwell Construction, a well-established company that specialized in residential developments and small commercial projects. Tom Hartwell, the owner, had known Joe for 30 years and trusted his recommendations implicitly. "Joe told me what happened with your family," Tom said during my interview. "Takes real character to handle that kind of betrayal with dignity, instead of bitterness. That's exactly the kind of integrity I want on my management team." The job paid $24 an hour plus benefits, significantly more than my previous position, with clear advancement opportunities as the company expanded into neighboring counties. My experience, combined with Joe's connections throughout the regional business community, made me valuable in ways I'd never expected. Weekends brought additional income through the handyman business. I'd started serving elderly clients Joe knew from his banking career. Word spread quickly through networks of trust that elderly people maintained, and soon I had steady work helping seniors with home maintenance, minor repairs, and accessibility improvements. "You remind me of your grandfather," Mrs. Patterson told me after I'd installed grab bars in her bathroom and repaired her front steps. Honest work, fair prices, and you actually show up when you say you will. That's rarer than it should be these days. My family's healing process had been slower, but surprisingly genuine. My parents attended weekly counseling sessions to understand their enabling patterns and develop healthier ways to support family members in crisis without rescuing them from natural consequences of poor choices. Once monthly, they visited Joe's farm for carefully structured conversations that gradually rebuilt our relationship on foundations of honesty rather than avoidance. The first several meetings were awkward and painful, but slowly we developed communication patterns based on truth instead of protecting each other from uncomfortable realities. I'm learning that helping and enabling are opposite things, Dad told me during one visit. For 24 years, I thought I was being a loving father by rescuing Amanda from consequences, but I was actually preventing her from growing into a responsible adult. Dad joined a support group for families affected by addiction and criminal behavior, connecting with other parents who'd struggled to balance love with accountability. I met other fathers who made the same mistakes I did, he explained. Children need consequences to develop character, and parents who prevent those consequences actually harm their children's development. Mom volunteered 15 hours weekly at a resource center for fraud victims, helping elderly people understand and recover from financial crimes, similar to what Amanda had committed. Working directly with Amanda's type of victims had transformed Mom's understanding of the real impact of her daughter's choices. I used to think Amanda's crimes were just about money, Mom said during one conversation. But working with elderly victims showed me she destroyed people's sense of safety and trust. Some of her victims are afraid to leave their homes now, because they don't know who they can trust with personal information. Joe's health news had initially seemed frightening, but his early-stage Parkinson's diagnosis had actually motivated positive changes throughout our family. Knowing that his time for active involvement was limited, Joe had decided to confront problems he'd been avoiding and share wisdom he'd been keeping to himself. I spent too many years hoping problems would solve themselves, Joe admitted. But some situations require direct action, even when that action feels harsh in the short term. Joe was systematically teaching me everything about property management, financial planning, and the business relationships he'd built over decades in the banking industry. We'd become true partners, with me handling physical work and daily operations, while he provided strategic guidance and community connections. "You've got natural business sense, Clayton," Joe said one evening as we reviewed rental income and maintenance expenses. "More importantly, you've got integrity. People trust you because they know you'll do what you say you'll do." Amanda's prison experience had surprised everyone with its apparent genuineness. 6 months after her sentencing, I received a letter that was completely different from any communication I'd ever received from her. "Clayton, I'm writing this letter for the 15th time because my counselor won't let me send versions that make excuses or blame other people for my choices. So here's the truth without manipulation. I destroyed our family because I was too proud and afraid to ask for help when I needed it." She was participating in intensive addiction counseling and psychological therapy, finally addressing underlying issues that had driven decades of destructive behavior. For the first time in her adult life, Amanda was taking full responsibility for her actions without deflection, manipulation, or attempts to minimize the harm she'd caused. "I'm learning that feeling good about myself through manipulation and lies was actually making me hate myself more," she wrote. "It's harder to accomplish things honestly, but the satisfaction feels real instead of hollow." I chose to respond to her letter, carefully establishing boundaries, while not completely cutting off the possibility of future reconciliation. "I hope you find genuine healing, Amanda. Recovery is possible, but it has to be your choice and your work, not something other people do for you." My relationships throughout the community had been completely restored and actually strengthened by how I'd handled the crisis. Marcus became a regular visitor to the farm, often bringing his wife and children for Sunday dinners that reminded me what healthy family relationships could look like. Mrs. Rodriguez helped organize community support for Joe as his Parkinson's symptoms slowly progressed, coordinating neighbors who could assist with tasks that became difficult for him. "You've shown everyone what real character looks like," she told me. "Standing up to lies without becoming bitter or vengeful. Jake Martinez had become not just a friend but a professional ally, referring construction clients to my handyman business and recommending me to contractors throughout the region. "I owe you for believing Amanda's manipulation," he said. "Let me help make things right by supporting your business." Detective Collins remained involved in my life as both a professional contact and personal friend, connecting me with other families who'd experienced similar manipulation and fraud. "You handle conflict with unusual maturity," she told me. "Have you ever considered law enforcement or social work?" Joe's decision to renovate the family house and rent it to deserving tenants had created both practical income and symbolic healing. I oversaw the renovation project, transforming the space where I'd been betrayed into something positive that would shelter a family who needed safe, affordable housing. The new tenants were a young military couple with 2 small children, people who'd served their country and deserved community support as they transitioned to civilian life. The rental income funded a scholarship Joe established in my grandmother's name for students pursuing trade careers like construction, plumbing, or electrical work. "Your grandmother believed in honest work and helping people build better lives," Joe explained. "This scholarship honors her values while helping young people develop skills they can use anywhere." Personally, my relationship with Sarah Williams had developed into something serious and stable. She taught 2nd grade at Millerville Elementary and appreciated the straightforward communication I'd learned through surviving manipulation and betrayal. "You don't play games or hide important information," Sarah said after we'd been dating for 4 months. "It's refreshing to be with someone who says what he means and means what he says." Sarah had her own experience with family dysfunction, having grown up with an alcoholic mother who'd used guilt and emotional manipulation to control family dynamics. Our shared understanding of manipulation tactics had created strong foundations for honest communication about difficult topics. "We both know what dishonest relationships look like," she said. "That makes us better at recognizing and maintaining healthy patterns." Financially, my situation had improved beyond anything I'd imagined possible during those dark days sleeping in my car behind Murphy's Diner. The investigation into Amanda's theft of my unemployment benefits resulted in full restitution plus penalties, restoring money I'd thought was lost forever. My credit rating and professional reputation had been legally restored through the criminal case proceedings. More than that, surviving false accusations had actually enhanced my credibility with people who mattered, demonstrating character under pressure that impressed employers and clients. Living with Joe and investing earnings wisely, I'd built an emergency fund that provided genuine financial security for the first time in my adult life. More importantly, I'd learned to recognize and protect myself from financial manipulation through education about fraud tactics and legal protections. I began speaking at high school assemblies about family dynamics, fraud awareness, and the difference between helping and enabling destructive behavior. Working with Detective Collins and social workers, I helped young people understand warning signs that might prevent them from becoming either victims or perpetrators of manipulation. "Real love sometimes requires saying no," I told students. "Protecting people from consequences doesn't help them grow stronger or more responsible." My parents' transformation had been remarkable in its thoroughness and apparent permanence. Dad received serious treatment for his gambling addiction, finally addressing issues that had never been completely resolved after Joe's intervention 15 years earlier. "I learned that my gambling wasn't really about money," Dad explained. "It was about avoiding feelings and responsibilities that seemed overwhelming. But avoiding problems always makes them bigger, not smaller." Mom joined a support group for parents whose children had committed serious crimes, learning from other families how to maintain relationships while establishing healthy boundaries. "We're learning to love Amanda without enabling her," Mom said. "Love means wanting the best for someone long-term, even when that requires short-term pain." They sold most of their possessions to pay restitution to Amanda's victims, working part-time jobs and rebuilding their lives with accountability instead of avoidance. Their small apartment was a dramatic change from the house they'd thought they owned, but their relationship was stronger than it had been in decades. "We're living within our means for the first time in 20 years, Dad told me. No secrets, no hidden debts, no pretending problems don't exist." On the 1-year anniversary of being thrown out of my childhood home, I hosted a dinner at Joe's farmhouse for everyone who'd supported me through the crisis and its aftermath. My parents attended along with Mrs. Rodriguez, Marcus and his family, Sarah, Detective Collins, Jake Martinez, and several neighbors who'd become genuine friends. For the first time in years, our family conversation was completely honest and authentic. No manipulation, no hidden agendas, no one walking on eggshells to avoid triggering conflict or drama. My father publicly thanked Joe for forcing accountability instead of enabling continued dysfunction. "You saved our family by refusing to let us destroy ourselves," Dad said, his voice steady and sincere. "We're finally dealing with reality instead of pretending problems don't exist." The life lessons had become integrated into my daily thinking and decision-making. Love sometimes requires difficult choices and firm boundaries. Helping people means supporting their growth toward independence, not protecting them from consequences that could teach important lessons. Family loyalty means encouraging accountability and responsible behavior, not covering up destructive patterns or enabling continued poor choices. Real relationships are built on truth and mutual respect, not manipulation and emotional blackmail. Joe's example had taught me that wisdom often means acting against immediate emotions for long-term benefit. Sometimes, Clayton, you have to let people face their consequences to give them a real chance to become better people. Amanda wrote from prison that she'd earned her high school equivalency diploma and was taking business classes through a correspondence program. She'd been selected for a work release program that would help her transition back to productive life after her sentence was completed. "I'm learning that I can feel good about myself through genuine accomplishment instead of manipulation," she wrote. "It requires more effort, but the satisfaction feels real instead of hollow and temporary." Joe updated his will to include educational provisions for Amanda's rehabilitation after her release, but only if she continued demonstrating genuine progress in counseling and behavior modification programs. "Everyone deserves a chance to rebuild their life," Joe explained. "But opportunity has to be earned through consistent, responsible choices, not automatically provided regardless of behavior." The family was creating new traditions based on mutual respect and honesty rather than manipulation and crisis management. Holiday gatherings were smaller but more genuine. Conversations addressed real issues constructively, instead of pretending problems didn't exist. Sarah and I had begun discussing marriage and building a life together based on trust, open communication, and shared values about honesty in relationships. "You've shown me what real love looks like," Sarah said. "It's not about avoiding conflict or pretending everything is perfect. It's about working through problems together with patience and honesty." Standing on Joe's front porch this morning, watching sunlight spread across fields that now felt like home, I thought about the letter I planned to write to Amanda. I wanted to encourage her continued progress while maintaining boundaries that protected both our recovery processes. My phone buzzed with a text from Sarah about our weekend plans to visit her parents and continue discussions about our future together. For the first time since childhood, I felt genuinely optimistic about family relationships, personal growth, and the possibility of building something lasting and meaningful. The most important realization had emerged gradually through months of reflection and recovery. Sometimes losing everything you thought you wanted is the only way to discover what you actually need. I'd lost a house, but found my real home. I'd lost enabling relationships, but discovered authentic family connections. I'd lost comfortable lies, but gained liberating truth. Real love isn't about protecting people from the natural consequences of their choices. It's about supporting them through the growth that consequences make possible. Justice isn't just about punishment or revenge. It's about creating space for truth, healing, and the development of authentic relationships based on mutual respect rather than manipulation. Joe had taught me that wisdom sometimes appears harsh to people who prefer comfortable lies to difficult truths. But enabling someone's destructive behavior isn't kindness or loyalty. It's actually cruelty disguised as love, preventing growth and prolonging suffering for everyone involved. My family was slowly rebuilding on a foundation of honesty instead of manipulation and avoidance. Amanda was learning to take responsibility for her choices and find satisfaction in genuine accomplishment. My parents were facing their own enabling patterns instead of projecting problems onto other family members. And I was learning that surviving betrayal doesn't have to create bitterness if you choose growth over resentment, wisdom over revenge, and truth over comfortable illusions. Sometimes the greatest gift life can offer is the chance to start over with better understanding of what really matters. Love, integrity, accountability, and the courage to face truth, even when that truth requires difficult changes. Now I want to hear from you. Have you ever experienced systematic manipulation from someone you trusted completely? How did you recognize the difference between helping and enabling destructive behavior? Sometimes real family loyalty means setting firm boundaries instead of rescuing people from consequences that could help them grow. Share your experiences in the comments below. Your story might help someone else recognize their own situation and find courage to choose truth over comfortable lies. If this story connected with you, please like this video to help others find it. Subscribe for more real stories about overcoming betrayal and finding justice. And share it with someone who might need to hear that accountability and truth are always worth fighting for, even when that fight feels impossible. Thank you for listening to my journey from betrayal to redemption. And remember, sometimes losing everything you thought you wanted is the first step toward finding everything you actually need.